Well, good morning again, and thanks for having me. Paul said a little while ago, he said, I want you to come and preach for us. I said, great. Hold it further away. There we go. Different rules at Maybridge. Paul said, what do you want to preach on? At Maybridge, we've been looking at Matthew's Gospel for 3.5 years, and we just finished last week. So I thought I want to do something totally different. So we're going to talk about a brilliant Old Testament character, David. If you've heard of David. The most famous thing about David has to be his fight with Goliath, right? Pretty much everybody knows at least a bit of this story. David has a one-on-one fight with a man 10 times his size, and somehow he wins. And I've just spoiled it for you. Somehow he wins. It is the underdog story, isn't it? Every year in the FA Cup, when the Dog and Duck 11 gets drawn against a Premier League club, someone inevitably says, it's a David versus Goliath tie. And then across the nation, all the neutrals root for the scrappy pub team, all their sympathetic enthusiasm fading when they're 3-0 down to Man City after 11 minutes. The original David and Goliath story, is in 1 Samuel. And in chapter 17, we are in the middle of the Old Testament's great story arc of the people of Israel. Israel have their first king, a man called Saul, but they keep getting attacked by their neighbors, especially a group called the Philistines. And when we join this story, the two armies are facing off. I'm just going to go through the story a bit at a time. And it says, the Philistines now mustered their army for battle and camped between Sukkot in Judah and Akazar at Ephes-Dammim. Saul countered by gathering his Israelite troops near the valley of Elah. So the Philistines and Israelites faced each other on opposite hills with the valley between them. So the scene is set. Two great armies gather either side of a valley. It's easy to imagine the tense combination of bravado and nervousness from each end. The Israelites are led by Saul, who was king in part because of his height. Yes, really. And the expectation would have been that Saul, as the king, would lead people in battle, because part of being king was to be the warrior champion of the nation. But Saul has a problem, as we read on. Then Goliath, a Philistine champion from Gath, came out of the Philistine ranks to face the forces of Israel. He was over 9 feet tall. He wore a bronze helmet, and his bronze coat of mail weighed 125 pounds. He also wore bronze leg armor, and he carried a bronze javelin on his shoulder. The shaft of his spear was as heavy and thick as a weaver's beam, tipped with an iron spearhead that weighed 15 pounds. His armor-bearer walked ahead of him carrying a shield. Goliath stood and shouted a taunt across to the Israelites. "Why are you all coming out to fight?" he called. "I am the Philistine champion, but you are only the servants of Saul. Choose one man to come down here and fight me. If he kills me, then we'll be your slaves. But if I kill him, you'll be our slaves. I defy the armies of Israel today. Send me a man who will fight me." When Saul and the Israelites heard this, they were terrified and deeply shaken. So Saul is tall, but the Philistines show up for a fight with a man called Goliath, who is a lot bigger even than him. Goliath, we are told, is the Philistine champion. Literally, that means he is the man in between. He's the man in between his army and the enemy. He's their representative. They're counting on him. And Goliath is huge. The NIV text says he's 9 feet tall, but that's based on a certain understanding of translating Hebrew lengths. It may well be that in our terms, he's over 7 feet tall, which is very, very tall by today's standards, but it's not impossible. Back there and then, the average person was about 9 inches shorter than now, so he's an absolute giant by any measure of the time, even more than he would be now. Goliath is not the kid who was picked on in the playground. He is freakishly massive, and the story gives us loads of detail about his armor. This is deliberate. He's being portrayed as an over-the-top embodiment of a hero. He's huge and he's strong, but he's also got the best military tech of the time. He's covered in bronze. Goliath's approach is this: I am bigger than you, I am stronger than you, I've got better resources than you, I'll kill you. I'll destroy you. And in many ways, Goliath kind of embodies how the world now often tells us how to make our way through life. Protect and promote yourself. Impose yourself as best as you can and make sure that you succeed. That's the sort of thing we've learned to tell ourselves about overcoming our great obstacles in life. Give yourself a pep talk, tell yourself how great you are, gather your resources, and then go for it. In the story, Goliath is hugely confident, and so much so that it tells us his armor bearer is carrying his shield. That means, this is important, Goliath is not going to be carrying it when the fight begins later. He's so confident, he doesn't even need a shield. Having introduced Goliath, the story immediately introduces his opponent. The contrast is deliberate to build up the anticipation for the fight. Now David was the son of a man named Jesse, an Ephrathite from Bethlehem in the land of Judah. Jesse was an old man at that time, and he had 8 sons. Jesse's 3 oldest sons, Eliab, Abinadab, and Shemaiah, had already joined Saul's army to fight the Philistines. David was the youngest son. David's 3 oldest brothers stayed with Saul's army, but David went back and forth so he could help his father with the sheep in Bethlehem. For 40 days, every morning and evening, the Philistine champion strutted in front of the Israelite army. One day Jesse said to David, "Take this basket of roasted grain and these 10 loaves of bread and carry them quickly to your brothers, and give these 10 cuts of cheese to their captain. See how your brothers are getting along and bring back a report of how they're doing." So opposite massive Goliath is little David. He's the youngest and smallest of 8 boys. He's a teenager at this point, no clue yet of the famous king he will become. He's a nobody. Some of his brothers are in the army, but David helps his old dad look after sheep in a town of no consequence. You get the impression that nobody even really respects David, let alone would consider picking him for a fight with a giant. Meanwhile, Goliath struts. I just imagine him doing bicep curls in the valley. He's flexing, he's really irritatingly smug, he's sneering, he's taunting the army. "Come on, you lot, you're all weak. Have you got anyone who can take me on? Look at how great I am." 400 curls right there. And he struts. But in contrast, David serves. He's like a delivery driver. He's just taking food and supplies to the troops. Then it continues. David's brothers were with Saul and the Israelite army at the valley of Elah, fighting against the Philistines. So David left the sheep with another shepherd and set out early the next morning with the gifts, as Jesse had directed him. He arrived at the camp just as the Israelite army was leaving for the battlefield with shouts and battle cries. Soon the Israelite and Philistine forces stood facing each other, army against army. David left his things with the keeper of supplies and hurried out to the ranks to greet his brothers. As he was talking with them, Goliath, the Philistine champion from Gath, came out from the Philistine ranks. Then David heard him shout his usual taunt to the army of Israel. As soon as the Israelite army saw him, they began to run away in fright. "Have you seen the giant?" the men asked. "He comes out each day to defy Israel. The king has offered a huge reward to anyone who kills him. He'll give that man one of his daughters for a wife, and the man's entire family will be exempted from paying taxes." David leaves the sheep, then he leaves the supplies. It's all symbolic storytelling. He's being separated from his past roles. He's done being a shepherd. He's done being a delivery boy. And finally, he gets to the front line, and he sees what's happening for himself. Goliath shouts all these taunts. The Israelite army are all there in fear. Every man in the army knows what the reward is for killing Goliath. It was common knowledge. If you kill him, you get a princess for a wife, and you never have to pay tax again. Those are really good rewards. It's like winning the lottery twice. But still nobody volunteers, which is telling. Doesn't matter what the prize is if you're dead, does it? They know they'll lose. And so literally nobody has volunteered. 40 days, they've looked at Goliath and gone, "No thank you." And so the deadlock continues, with no end in sight. The people of Israel need a champion who has both the bravery and the ability to deal with Goliath. David asked the soldier standing nearby, "What will a man get for killing this Philistine and ending his defiance of Israel? Who is this pagan Philistine anyway, that he's allowed to defy the armies of the living God?" And these men gave David the same reply. They said, "Yes, that is the reward for killing him." But when David's oldest brother Eliab heard David talking to the men, he was angry. "What are you doing round here anyway?" he demanded. "What about those few sheep you're supposed to be taking care of? I know about your pride and deceit. You just want to see the battle." "What have I done now?" David replied. I'm imagining he's got a cracked teenage boy accent voice. "I was only asking a question." He walked over to some others and asked them the same thing and received the same answer. David makes sure it's clear what the reward is, and by now you can see where it's heading. He's considering taking on Goliath. But he's not just motivated by the reward. He asks, who is this guy that he's allowed to defy the armies of the living God? David is surprised because, much as he's of no consequence, he believes in God. He believes God is living and powerful. And he asks, how dare this admittedly massive bloke come and start a fight with us? Who does he think he is? And his brother speaks in the way that older brothers always do. It's the brother banter, isn't it? What are you doing around here anyway? You just want to see the battle. He belittles David's value. He questions his character. You're nobody, David. You just want to see something exciting. And it's at this point that the story takes an amazing turn. David's question was reported to King Saul, and the king sent for him. "Don't worry about this Philistine," David told Saul. "I'll go fight him." "Don't be ridiculous," Saul replied. "There's no way you can fight this Philistine and possibly win. You're only a boy, and he's been a man of war since his youth." But David persisted. "I've been taking care of my father's sheep and goats," he said. "When a lion or a bear comes to steal a lamb from the flock, I go after it with a club and rescue the lamb from its mouth. If the animal turns on me, I catch it by the jaw and club it to death. I've done this to both lions and bears, and I'll do it to this pagan Philistine too, for he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the claws of the lion and the bear will rescue me from this Philistine." Saul finally consented. "All right, go ahead," he said, "and may the Lord be with you." The king, Saul, hears of David's question, teenage boy, and sends for him. Why would he do that? Saul has waited 40 days for anyone to volunteer, and nobody has. So he's probably just shocked that this young boy has put his hand up and thought, I need to see this person. And what happens next is remarkable. Listen to this. The biggest miracle of this famous story is not what happens in the fight. It's not. The miracle in this story is that Saul entrusts the fate of the nation to an obscure shepherd boy. That's the miracle. To an apparently weak representative. An apparently weak saviour. It's a massive risk. But David persuades him. Amazingly, David is just as confident as Goliath. He's got some experience, he's fought wild animals, and he thinks, well, this is pretty similar. He's just like a bear, really, isn't he? I'll have a go. Saul must have been worn down by the pestering. He's got no other options. It's incredible that he agrees to this. The fate of the nation in the hands of a teenage lad with a plucky attitude and a sling. Then Saul gave David his own armour, a bronze helmet and a coat of mail. David put it on, strapped the sword over it, took a step or two to see what it was like, for he'd never worn such things. "I can't go in these," he protested to Saul. "I'm not used to them." So David took them off again. He picked up 5 smooth stones from a stream and put them in his shepherd's bag. And then, armed only with his shepherd's staff and sling, he started across the valley to fight the Philistine. Goliath walked out toward David with his shield bearer ahead of him, sneering in contempt at the ruddy-faced boy. "Am I a dog," he roared at David, "that you come at me with a stick?" And he cursed David by the names of his gods. "Come over here, and I'll give your flesh to the birds and wild animals," Goliath yelled. This is a deliberately ridiculous scene. Israel's champion can't even wear the armor. He's too small. Goliath is still deeply smug. He's preening in the middle of no man's land between the armies. Like, in Gladiators. Have you been watching Gladiators since it started again? And they do all the flexing and all that. That's Goliath, basically, in this valley. But seeing David makes him angry. And you can understand why. For Goliath, this is insulting. That Israel would waste his time sending this little teenager to him. It's an insult to his greatness. He sneers in contempt. David replied to the Philistine, "You come to me with sword, spear, and javelin. I come to you in the name of the Lord of heaven's armies, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." It's quite a long speech. "Today the Lord will conquer you, and I'll kill you and cut off your head. Then I'll give the dead bodies of your men to the birds and wild animals, and the whole world will know there's a God in Israel. And everyone assembled here will know that the Lord rescues his people, but not with sword and spear. This is the Lord's battle, and he will give you to us." Notice how David credits God with victory before it even happens. He's portrayed as a man who, whatever else is true of him, is tuned into God. He sees situations, problems, opportunities as things that occur within a world that God maintains and oversees. Note that David's faith, though, does not mean he just sits down, closes his eyes and prays. I'm sure he did pray, hoping that God will smite Goliath and make the whole thing easier. When he says that God will rescue his people not with sword and spear, I don't think he's expecting a miracle. David is literally about to engage in a battle with different weapons. He knows he's going to win, and he's going to win because he's going to change the nature of the fight. This is very shrewd. But at no point does David claim victory for himself. His perspective is that this is a battle for the victory of God. Then we get into the fight. As Goliath moved closer to attack, David quickly ran out to meet him. Reaching into his shepherd's bag and taking out a stone, he hurled it with his sling and hit the Philistine in the forehead. The stone sank in, and Goliath stumbled and fell face down on the ground. So David triumphed over the Philistine with only a sling and a stone, for he had no sword. Then David ran over and pulled Goliath's sword from its sheath. David used it to kill him and cut off his head. This is the moment. When anyone talks about a David versus Goliath battle, it's all based on this paragraph. But look at how it plays out. You know, if they do this sort of on Sky Sports, they do some punditry after the fight. Here it is. Goliath cannot possibly have been nimble or quick. He's huge and he's covered in metal. He's not moving quickly. David is small, no armor, massive speed advantage. He's also experienced with a sling, so he runs to just the right position, not too close, not too far. He knows exactly where he needs to be. Somebody who used a sling in this era, if they were skilled, could get a small stone to travel at around 60 miles an hour. Goliath's a slow target. David surely is a good shot, given his experience. Hitting Goliath, who, let's remember, is defenseless because he arrogantly chose not to bring his shield, in the forehead with a stone at 60 miles an hour is enough to take him down. And so David wins by changing the terms of the fight. He cuts off Goliath's head like he said he would, meaning he could hold it up to the Philistines and say, "Look, no ambiguity here. Your champion has definitely been defeated. It's all over." That's the story. Great story, isn't it? What's it all about? Well, I'm sure he didn't plan this, but I think Goliath embodies everything about how our culture says you need to do your life. We are conditioned to approach the world in a Goliath-like way. We're trained to think, impose yourself on life. And like Goliath, we cover ourselves in our own armor, our achievements, our prestige, our money, our social connections. Many of us hiding our true selves behind a screen of confidence. We give ourselves little pep talks about the need to assert ourselves. We hide our inner weaknesses that we're all too aware of in moments of painful honesty. Goliath shows us a way of life that is dependent on you, the individual, to perform. If you can muster the bravery, the strength, the swagger to make life work, then great. If you can't, tough. The way of Goliath offers nothing to real-life situations which require long and, dare we say, unwinnable struggles. If you have a crippling long-term sickness or a difficult relationship or financial worries, the Goliath approach of just asserting yourself will not work. It won't fix life for you. It will leave you in a mess. Whilst Goliath is the way of our world, good church people give our attention to the story's main character, David, don't we? As Christians, he's the great example, right? He's the hero, after all. And the most popular way that people read the David and Goliath story is a source of inspiration. You know, David, he was small, but he humbly summoned some courage. He made a great plan. He got his resources together, and he went and conquered his giant. Amazing. And so the thinking goes, that's what we should do when we face our inevitable giants of life. And we think, or we tend to think, if we simply copied David's faith and trusted God and faced our giants, he would grant us victory every time in the great obstacles of life. We'd be the winning underdogs. And it's not hard to see why that interpretation of the story would be so appealing. Who doesn't want to be the hero in their own life? In reality, to read the story of David that way is just a more spiritual sounding version of the Goliath approach. The onus is still on you and me to perform. If we can't deliver, maybe by having great faith, then tough. It's a very religious idea. We try hard to be good, to do the right things, to do well. We have enough faith. And if we do it right, we'll be rewarded. And unfortunately, a lot of people in church think that following Jesus is exactly like that. But it isn't. Here's the thing. The wider story of the Bible is very clear that neither you or I are the hero of our lives. This is a great shame if you want to be the hero, but it's very reassuring if you know that you cannot defeat all life's challenges on your own. The David and Goliath story is something much better than an example. It's a picture of where we are in the bigger story. In the story, the Israelite army are the normal people. They are the ones that are like us. They face a powerful giant, and they're afraid. And there's great rewards, but none of them can fight him because they'll die. And then someone comes along and says that he can beat Goliath. And they mock him. And then a miracle happens, in that this man who looks small and weak is entrusted with their fate. And amazingly, he defeats the giant that they fear. All they have to do is let him fight for them. And after he's won, they cheer and sing songs about his victory. Here's the big thing. David is not an example for the people of Israel. He's not an inspiration. He fights Goliath, and they just watch. They don't do anything. David is a savior who comes in weakness. And he doesn't win despite his weakness, he wins because of it. Because he's so laughable, he comes without armor. Goliath doesn't even bring his shield. In the end, David wins actually because he's a shepherd, not a soldier. And it's because of that he's uniquely able to save his people. When it looks like all is lost, the one who looks weak is mocked and bravely substitutes in for his people and takes down the unbeatable giant for them. That's the story. 1,000 years later, 1,000 years after David held Goliath's dripping head to the sky in victory, the New Testament explains what Jesus did in ways that are eerily similar. Our true enemy is not an external thing like a giant. It's our own sin, our selfishness, our inadequacy, our fear, ultimately our death outside a relationship with God. And we cannot beat those things through gathering resources or life coaching or self-help. We can't win. The giant's too powerful. But Jesus steps up, comes forward from the crowd to be our substitute and our champion. And often the initial reaction of people to Jesus is to mock him. How could a 2,000-year-old Jewish teacher from an obscure place be a champion over anything? He's weak. I've got my own armor, I'm wealthy, I'm capable, I'm strong mentally. But somehow, something has happened in millions of people who say, I've got nothing else. I will let you be my champion, Jesus. My fate's in your hand. Miraculously, we let him be our savior. And on the cross and in resurrection, Jesus completely defeats the real giants of selfishness, inadequacy, fear, and death. Not using the weapon anyone expected. He didn't even use force. He did it as a shepherd, not a soldier. And like the watching army of Israel, we get to share in the victory. In the New Testament book we call Hebrews, it's all about how Jesus fulfills various themes and threads of the Old Testament. And it tells us in Hebrews to remember David, among others, remember him, but fix your eyes on Jesus. And then it calls Jesus an archegos, a word which means champion. David is great, but mainly because he points us to the real champion. The real champion, Jesus, saves us because he was strong enough to make himself weak. All we're meant to do, all we need to do, is believe him, join in with his people, get all the fruit of the victory. He's already won. And we gather and we do church, and we cheer and we're happy and we sing songs about it. He's not just our inspiration for good living. He's our champion for real life. And that's the point of the David and Goliath story. And it's wonderful. Over to you.
Thank you, Matt. The band would like to come. Let's stand, shall we? And we'll pray into that.